presentation is called Productivity, Health and Wellbeing from Working in Green Buildings. Can we find win-win-win solutions? I noticed in the session misses out one of the wins, so I'll talk about that when we get there. Really what I'm talking about is, can we find things that are good for the environment, good for productivity, in other words, make money for the organization, and are good for the occupants in the building. So that's when I talk about win-win-win, I'm really talking about those three wins. When I start off, we need to talk about who do we build buildings for. And when we speak to architects tell us that basically they build buildings for property developers, for homeowners, or commissioned in various different courageous buildings. What we do when we get commissioned buildings is that we very often get things which are designed for what the developers want, and not necessarily for what the people inside the buildings want, or for that matter the people who have to look at the buildings from the outside. If you look at that silly little basket on the side, which is a building in the United States. What else do we build buildings for? Well, the architects themselves build buildings for aesthetic appeal, to win awards. Here we start moving more into the types of public aesthetic and urban visual appeal or urban flow. It starts to look a little bit more like the types of buildings that we expect to see from the outside, things that look visually attractive. And these are buildings that usually win awards. The one now in the bottom right-hand corner is one which is a building in Masdar in the Arab Emirates. It hasn't yet been built. That's just a conceptualization of what we might do. So we start seeing buildings that people will find a little bit more appealing. What I'm interested in, because I'm a psychologist, is looking at the people who work and live inside these buildings. And if we, for example, look at an office building, and we take are the salaries associated with the buildings themselves. You'll notice that those building, yes, there are costs in terms of building a building, but that's usually one-off costs. I seem to be getting some strange bit of feedback on here at the moment. My apologies for that. We didn't get this when we tested it out 2 weeks ago, but yeah, let me see how that goes. So the main costs are associated with salary costs, which take up almost 60% of living in a building. The types of things which green building people are really interested in are the costs associated with the utilities. In other words, paying for water and lights and refuse removal. And if you look at that, those are incredibly tiny compared to the types of costs associated with salary. It means then that in order for a building to be effective, when we're talking about win-win solutions, it needs to be good for the employees, and it also needs to be good for the environment. But the way in which these two things overlap, or making sure that the physical work environment that we're looking at can also lead to increased productivity, because the salary bill is the biggest thing. The way in which we can create the best amounts of win for the organization is by increasing the productivity that we get from the same types of salaries that we might pay. What that means then is, when we look at building occupants, what are we actually building buildings for? So the types of things which we build buildings for when we're concerned with their building occupants is making sure that we offer shelter. That means shelter from the environment, keeping out things like cold and heat, sun and rain, winds, and all sorts of other types of environmental, physical environmental issues. We also are looking at a place to basically keep stuff, I'll put that in inverted commas, and making sure that we don't just put it somewhere, but we actually keep it safe so someone doesn't come along and take it away from us unnecessarily. The third thing which it looks at is it also enables us to offer more control over those things in A, in other words, the way in which the physical environment impacts on building occupants, and also some control over the place we put our stuff and how we keep it safe. And finally, we can also look at how we connect with other people. In other words, buildings enable us, or for that matter, don't enable us to make connections with other people, while at the same time satisfying the comments on A, B, and C above. The problem with buildings, though, is that they also block certain things and trap certain things. So the first thing we need to worry about is that the buildings block out things which are actually freely available to us, things like fresh air, things like daylight. And because we put walls around them and in some cases even block out what's happening from the outside, they also contain things which we would really like to try to get rid of. And these include things like carbon dioxide, which we all breathe, volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. And in winter time, or in times when colds and flus are going around, they trap viruses, and they sometimes circulate viruses, which means being inside is actually more dangerous for our health than being outside. And from a connection point of view, buildings constrain the types of movements which we have. For example, by having ramps and stairs, they ensure that we can only get to certain different types of buildings, either by taking ramps or stairs or elevators or escalators. And they also constrain the types of ways in which we might organize work. For example, cubicles constrain the types of interactions which we're able to have with people. On the opposite end of that, if we have open plan offices, they constrain the types of volumes of noise that we're able to have, even though they might enable groups and teams of people to interact with one another more easily. But essentially what you've got to worry about then is how we manage to constrain and organize the work that we see around us. The way in which we make connections then between the building occupants and the types of things which building owners are interested in looking at is through a number of different ways. The way in which we looked at this with the World Green Building Council was to look at three different aspects. Those are three different grey aspects on the left-hand side of this particular diagram. They are the ambient conditions, the spatial factors, and the local location and amenities that we might have. And these are different interactions, and I'll talk about those different interactions at the moment, in a short moment. When we talk about ambient conditions, what we're basically talking about when we talk about ambient conditions are the lighting conditions, the type of acoustic environment, in other words, things like noise or the ability to be able to hear other people in our environment, like, for example, one of these things that we have now, listening over a microphone, the ventilation and the fresh air intake that we might have, the heat and cooling, and also the environment which we have around that, which is the condition of the air itself. In other words, it's free from pollutants, and at the same time we make sure that it's not too dry or too humid. When we talk about the spatial factors, I was talking about that a short while ago. What we're talking about in the spatial factors are the way in which the work itself can be organized and laid out and set out. Sorry, I'm getting feedback again. And also the way in which it might be ergonomically designed. In other words, the type of efficiencies that we have in that space, as well as the layout of the work environment to make sure that it isn't damaging to the people in that environment. And then the final thing that we can look at is location and amenities. Location means how do we connect with things like transport systems and how those transport systems allow people to get to and from their places of work or their places where they live efficiently, without necessarily having to take carbon-intensive types of transport systems. It also means how we connect to other different types of amenities. For example, if we're working in a work environment and we need to go off to the shops, how close are those shops? Do we need to hop in a car or hop on a bus or hop on a train in order to get somewhere? Or are they easily located within the place where we work? And the other types of amenities that we might look at are also things like parks and places where we can go and relax and get in touch with, for example, with nature or with other people. Now, the ways in which this can interact with, particularly when we're looking at work environments, which is what we were looking at in the World Green Building Council, is through two different mechanisms. Either through well-being. Well-being, here we're talking largely about psychological well-being. And the second mechanism is through health. In other words, physical health. So some of these things impact, some of these different conditions might impact directly, let's say, for example, on our physical well-being. So ambient conditions, if the ambient conditions are anything but optimal, they'll start to make us feel a little bit irritated, and of course that's not good for our well-being and our perceived comfort. A similar type of thing can happen with the spatial factors. If, for example, we have to go up and down a set of stairs just to connect, let's say, for example, with the bathroom or with a key colleague, every single time we need to connect with them, then we're going to get irritated, and again our well-being is going to drop. When we look at location, again, if we need to hop in a car every single time that we need to go and find some amenities, or for that matter, it takes us a long time to get to work. We spend hours and hours sitting in transport or on public transport. That's going to affect our well-being. We're going to arrive at work irritated and wanting to, and basically wanting to throttle someone. And again, that's not going to be productive in terms of work productivity. We can look at the same thing in terms of health. Some of the ambient conditions can be so detrimental that they can have direct effects on our physical health. So, for example, viruses, rhinoviruses, which normally we find during wintertime, might circulate through the ventilation systems and mean that a lot of people get sick. And when one person gets sick in the workplace, a lot of other people are then going to be getting sick. So it can affect your health directly. There are lots of other things, for example, light and glare can affect your eyes and your eyesight. From the spatial factor side of things, we can look at a lot of ways in which it can positively affect our health. So, for example, if you're using the stairs a lot, that can actually have a positive effect on your health. You're using cardio exercise, you're actually creating endorphins, and that can have positive impacts on your health, but you can also have negative impacts on your health. So, for example, if you constantly are in a constrained position in the workplace, you can have back pain and other types of musculoskeletal disorders that can impact on your physical health. And location can also have a direct impact. Location and amenities can have a direct impact on physical health. For example, being able to go out and run in a park during a break, having easy access to those types of facilities, let's say, for example, like biking facilities, can have a direct impact on your physical health. In the same way that not having those types of facilities may have a negative impact on your physical health. Now, here we start seeing a number of different ways in which it can impact then on the types of things which organizations are interested in, and that is work performance and productivity. The one way in which it can impact on your work performance and productivity is through a concept which we call organizational citizenship behaviors, or OCB, or work engagement. In other words, it can have an indirect effect on work performance by how you are wanting to be at work, in other words, wanting to be in that particular organization for long periods of time doing those types of work, and how you're actually able to engage with the work itself, in other words, work engagement. There are also mechanisms which can impact directly on your work performance. In other words, if you're physically ill, you're going to be absent from work more often, or alternatively, you'll be in a case of what we call presenteeism, at work but not being able to function to your full capacity. Similar type of thing happens with well-being. When you are well at work and you're feeling psychologically well, you're more likely to invest a lot more effort on your work performance. And what we also need to look at over here is also looking at the connection then between work performance and productivity. productivity is really what the organization is interested in looking at, but it's impacted by so many other things. At the bottom right-hand side of this diagram, there's a number of different things which also impact on one's organization's productivity, including things like the context and the economic climate that one finds in, but also things like the leadership climate. How does the leadership enable work to take place, and the types of resources which are available in the organization. In other words, an organization can't produce if the people in the organization are not provided with the right types of resources. In the same way, work performance is also impacted by a number of different things, including the individual's context, the supervision which one is given, the skills which a person has, and the abilities which a person has. So really, when we're looking at the types of outcomes which organizations are interested in looking at, they're looking at work performance and productivity. And what this diagram intends to demonstrate is how we take the built environment and how that might then lead to the types of things which organizations are interested in work performance and productivity. Then what I'm really interested in talking about in this presentation is looking at the things where we might find win-win-win solutions. So when I talk about win-win solutions, or win-win-win solutions, we're talking about things which are good for the building occupants. That's win-one. Things which are good for the building owners or the tenants inside these buildings, and these are economic benefits, I call that win-two. And then the third thing that we have is the impact, or for that matter, have a positive impact on the natural systems around our built environment. I call that win-three. And there really are three main ways in which we can achieve this, and these are the three things that I'm going to concentrate on, and I'll give some examples about what that might mean. The first way is talking about daylight and shade. Second thing is talking about natural ventilation, and the third thing is talking about spatial design. But enough about that at the moment. I'll go on and start talking about those things straight away. First one is talking a little bit earlier today and yesterday, is that daylight is this incredible free resource. What it means if we use daylight in our buildings is that it'll reduce the amount of artificial light fittings that we actually need in the buildings. Reducing the amounts of artificial lightings that we have in the buildings will basically mean that we don't need to use as much energy to light our buildings. In the same way, we are making sure that daylight, which is incredibly good for human beings, from a psychological perspective, daylight has been, for example, connected to things like a lack of depression. Also, from a task lighting point of view, daylight is the best type of light in things like color rendering, and also being able to see print and those types of things which we might see inside our working environment. But daylight requires windows. And windows have other types of things which we also need to talk about when I talk about the buts a little bit lower. In order for the daylight to work, it also into the buildings, and it also requires intelligent interior design. The office which I'm sitting at the moment, which you can't actually see, is actually quite poor in that regard because it sits in more closed types of offices, which means that if you're on the other side of the building, the light doesn't penetrate to that side as well as it does on my side of the building, and if you're in the corridor in between, no light gets to there, and so you have to use artificial light all the time. What we also need to be careful of when we talk about daylight is that we can also get excessive light levels. So, for example, in summertime, you may get an enormous amount of light, which can also increase things like the heat inside the building. You also get daylight which can cause an enormous amount of glare, and of course because you can't control exactly where the sun is at any particular moment in the day, you then need to make sure that you try to control that type of glare in some way. And particularly when we're looking at office work, there are times when you need to work at night, and there are times when you need to work in adverse weather conditions. I understand that some parts of the United States, for example, are undergoing some fairly adverse weather conditions at the moment, and depending on where you are in the world, there will also be seasonal variances. Particularly if you're far north and far south, you'll get much greater variances in where the sun comes into the building. And of course the sun will set earlier in winter time, and it'll be longer in summertime. So you need to be able to account for these types of materials. When we look at it from an efficiency point of view, daylights can displace anywhere between 35% and 75% of today's artificial lighting, if used intelligently. This is an example of a classroom in the United States at a particular university, and you can see how well the light can actually come in and actually reduce the glare in this particular type of environment. When we look at the published literature, what we find from the published literature is, and this is a study from 2005 in South Korea, is we found that when you allow more light to come into a room, and in this case they were talking about hospital rooms, what they found was that they found a 41% reduction in the average length of stay. Here they were looking at gynecology patients. These actually were patients who were coming in to either have surgical procedures, cesarean sections and other types of gynecological surgical procedures, including birth procedures. So people who were actually in lit rooms actually stayed in their hospital beds for a shorter period of time and actually were able to leave the hospital a lot sooner. And also a 26% reduction in the average length of stay among surgery ward patients. What was quite important over here for this particular hospital is that what a hospital does is it charges more for the first day, and then the longer you stay in the hospital, you actually the per day fees that you're actually charging to the patients actually reduce over time. And so it makes sense for a hospital to actually get patients to come into those hospitals and to stay there for a shorter period of time from a financial point of view. And from a well-being point of view, obviously people who go into hospital don't want to spend a long period of time in hospital. They want to go back and spend time with their family and their loved ones, and in some instances even get back to work. And so we see win-win-win solutions by increasing and improving daylight, although there are some things that we need to look out for. One of the things I talked about when I talked about daylighting is you also need to worry about the issue about shading. Now there are two different ways in which we can provide shading to cope for the types of things like glare and seasonal variations in light. The one is actually fitted shading to the outside of the building, and there are some fairly sophisticated ways in which you can get fitted shading that can control for different things that happen during the day and during different times of the month. Let's say, for example, like light sensors on the shading that actually account for the amount of light that's hitting the shading, and actually the shading can come down and move up depending on, let's say, for example, the time of day or the amount of light which is reaching on the shades, or alternatively natural shading. The nice thing about natural shading is that it also provides some other types of beneficial aspects. So, for example, if you use deciduous trees, you will find that the types of shading which you find in summertime, when it's really, really hot, and the trees can actually provide more shading. And in winter time, when it's really, really cold, you can let the light come into the building and actually warm up the building. We do have to be a little bit careful because sometimes seasonal variances are either very difficult to control for or very expensive to control for. So, for example, when I'm talking about natural shading, it can work in some instances depending on the orientation of the building, but then again, there are some things which are really difficult to control for. So, for example, in winter time, when the sun is low on the horizon, you might get a lot of sunlight coming in which heats up the building, which is good. So you reduce the amounts of costs associated with ventilation and cooling systems, heating and cooling systems, but it might actually make the building too hot, and that certainly you do find that in more in climates such as Africa and along the equator. Here's some examples of shading and natural shading. When we talk about shading itself, it can reduce the cooling that we need, for example, in summertime, anywhere between 20 and 40%. So that's a reduction purely then in the amenities that are going on, and it can also reduce glare inside. So in other words, it's more appropriate, and they don't have glare which is interfering with the types of tasks which are going on. The second thing which we can look at then is ventilation. Daylight can have a heating effect in the wintertime, and shade can have a cooling effect in summertime, and that can help with our ventilation system, so our ventilation systems don't need to work overtime. in those different types of seasons. So there's an interactive effect between the types of shading which we have, or the shading we don't have, and the heating and cooling and the ventilation systems that our buildings require. The other thing which we can look at that will have a big impact then on the environment would be things around the outdoor intake and using natural ventilation systems. What this will mean is that we don't need to use resource and energy-intensive ventilation systems to pump air through our buildings. We can actually look at different ways of designing our ventilation systems so that they can, for example, produce outdoor air and bring out outdoor air or natural ventilation into the building. We also would then need to improve the air filtration. So if we do have to circulate the air, so for example, if the outdoor air is really, really cold, which I'm assuming you get a lot in the Canadian winter and the North American winter, then you need to make sure that you improve the air filtration system so that you can filter out organic and inorganic compounds which one finds within the built environment. And also what we need to do then is, sorry, this should actually have been a point when we're talking about lighting, is we need to separate out task lighting from ambient lighting. Sorry, that should actually have been a point when we're talking about lighting itself. We also need to make sure then the big buts, which when we come talking about ventilation systems, are various different types of seasonal variances, especially temperature, and how we need to go about controlling those. I already talked about the Canadian winter. But in tropical climes, we also need to worry about the high degree of humidity, which we need to control for. Let's say, for example, in tropical parts of Africa or South America or Asia, and the heat that we need to control in places like, let's say, for example, the Middle East and other types of desert climes. A lot of this also depends on the quality of the outdoor air. I've always turned around to people and advised them on here that if the outdoor air can sometimes be worse than the indoor air, particularly if you're working in very busy built environments. Things like Beijing, you don't really want to use a lot of outdoor intake unless you're going to filter that. And also if you're looking at ventilation, natural ventilation systems or of outdoor intakes, you've also got to worry about the acoustic qualities of the outdoor environment. If it's too noisy outside, what you may be doing is increasing the natural ventilation, but also increasing or decreasing the acoustic environment. In other words, making it too loud for people if, for example, you're on a very busy road. So natural ventilation systems themselves can displace anywhere up to 80% of today's ventilation systems just by doing things like having opening doors and opening windows. Again, a lot of this depends on where you are and how easy it is to do this. It can't be done in every single circumstance. Here's some more empirical work that looks at that in a study in 2004. Essentially what they were doing over here is they were looking at a natural ventilation system, and here they were looking at an office environment in France. They were primarily looking at middle-aged women. That was the nature of this particular organization. And what they found was that the natural ventilation reduced the numbers of doctor's visits by a small amount, but a significant amount. They also reduced the amount of hospital stays and the amounts of days which were absent from sick leave. So you can see over here that already they're having some profound impacts on productivity in the workplace, purely by using natural ventilation, as well as making sure that there's the well-being of people in the building and reducing the amount of energy which we would use for these particular types of systems. Here's another study. This particular study looked at airborne rhinoviruses, in other words, basically upper respiratory tract infections, which you found. This is a building in Boston, and what they found was that when you reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment, in the indoor environment, what it also did is reduce the amounts of colds which people had. So presumably what is happening is by having an increased amount of carbon dioxide in that environment, you're actually putting a strain on your immune system. So the airborne rhinoviruses which are there are actually more likely to have an impact on well-being. It also has an impact on the amount of irritants that we get in our respiratory system, and therefore allows the rhinoviruses to enter the system a lot more easier if for example, our nasal passages are inflamed from high degrees of carbon dioxide. So there are some complex medical interactions that are taking place, which can be reduced if we allow more fresh air to enter our building rather than letting the carbon dioxide recirculate through the building. Here's another study. This is a study in a school environment, and essentially what they did is they had what they call a displacement ventilation system. What happens with a displacement ventilation system is that you have fresh air coming in through the floor, and you have stale and older air and carbon dioxide vents that happen near the top of the building. So what ends up happening is you have a natural flow that moves through the building. And what happened in these schools in Sweden is they found a 69% reduction in the incidence of asthma. Again, this has probably got to do with the displacement and making sure that all the pollutants in the air were moved to the top of the building and could be moved from the building itself, and new fresh air intake could come through the bottom. And what's important to notice over here, and this is in a Swedish environment, and I know that the Swedish winters get quite cold, so it's a very clever system to make sure that they can do that throughout the year.